Well guys, welcome back to another Gideon Stuff adventure. We're out in the Manzano mountains. Got Janelle with me. Very last minute adventure. This was really off the cuff, but I think it's gonna be a fun one. We're gonna be climbing Manzano Peak, which is a high point in this range. It's at an elevation of 10,099 feet. A little bit windy today. I think the mountain's got about 4,000 feet of prominence. I'll put all the stats on the screen. And as far as the trail goes, we're starting out on the Kaiser Trail. We just started. We're gonna follow this for a little bit and then connect to the Manzano Peak Trail. And all in all, should be little over 7 miles and about 2,200 feet of gain. So very, very doable. I think that's gonna be pretty cool. So as usual, I did no research on geology of this place we're coming out. Right now we're walking over a lot of metamorphic rocks, some quartzites, some metavolcanics it looks like. And it looks to me like these ridges there, and especially, there's not a great view of it right now, but these ridges up here are kind of tabular and gray. To me that stinks of limestone. So I'm thinking what we're going to be seeing here is our Precambrian basement, and as we climb up we're going to start transitioning into the Paleozoic. So these are going to be some of our ancient passive margin ocean seds. Probably, oh, I don't know the ages out here. Down south of here a little ways, driving up, I saw the Abo Formation, which is Permian, about the latest of the Paleozoic. And well, it's a marginal marine sed unit, primarily siltstone. So I would be guessing that some of the stuff we're going to be seeing today is probably Pennsylvanian or around there somewhere. This mountain range is going to be kind of similar in geology to the Sandias, I feel like, which are just to the north here. So yeah, we're going to have metamorphic rocks and then Paleozoic seds.
Okay, so I was wrong. We did not end up seeing limestones at the top of these ridges. That is why it is always good to actually walk to the rocks and look at them. And we do that later on in the video, but for right now, it's everyone's favorite part of the video. It's where I interrupt the awesome outdoor adventure and I nerd out about rocks. The Manzano Mountains are part of a string of mountains called the Sandia-Manzano Mountain Chain. And this goes from the Sandia Mountains in the north, up around Albuquerque, to the Manzano Mountains in the south, closer to Berlin and Mountain Air. And in the middle are the Manzanita Mountains, which is some lower kind of hills that separate the Sandias from the Manzanos. If we look right here on our handy dandy geologic map of New Mexico, this is the mountain chain that I'm talking about right here. These are the Sandias, here's the Manzanitas, and here are the Manzano Mountains. The Los Pinos Mountains down here kind of grade in to this range, but it's not considered part of the same range. We can kind of trace out the western section of this range by these kind of darker colored rocks, some kind of browns and grays and maroon colors. These are going to be Proterozoic rocks. We'll talk about those here in a little bit. And then here on the western side, we see some Paleozoic rocks. Primarily limestones and other passive margin marine sediments. So these are going to be our older rocks, and in fact these are among some of the oldest rocks in New Mexico. The range trends north-south on the eastern side of the Rio Grande Rift. Of course, we talk about the Rio Grande Rift a lot on this channel. This is pretty much the extent of the rift right here. We can see that we're bounded on either side by mountain chains. These dark lines through here are faults. These are going to be mostly normal faults in this this half-graben system of the Rio Grande Rift. Over here we have the Estancia Basin. Here is the Albuquerque Basin. We're not going to touch too much on these features in this video. The Estancia Basin used to have a huge lake in it. Just, I don't know, kind of a fun fact. But the existence of these basins is tied to the fact that we have these high mountains right here. Interesting feature about the Manzano Sandia mountain chain is many people consider this to be the easternmost extent of the Basin and Range province, or at least this is the easternmost major mountain range of the Basin and Range province. Even though the Rio Grande Rift a lot of times is talked about as its own unique thing because it is just kind of one big linear feature, many geologists will also include it in conversations with the rest of the Basin and Range and will include the Rio Grande Rift itself as part of the Basin and Range province. I love Paleoproterozoic tectonics. That's what I've done research in, although I did research on these rocks in the San Andres Mountains rather than up in the Manzano Mountains. But we're going to be talking about kind of the same time period of geologic history. Now, Paleoproterozoic tectonics get very complicated, very, very complex, and there's a lot that we don't know. So we're not going to spend a whole lot of time delving super deep into this topic, but it is very, very interesting, and I do want to talk about it at least a little bit. The oldest rocks in the Manzano Mountains are between 1.65 billion years old and 1.6 billion years old, and they belong to a group called the Manzano group. And they are all primarily metamorphic rocks, metasedimentary and metavolcanic. Before we go too much further, what is a metamorphic rock? Well, there are three kinds of rocks: igneous, sedimentary, and metamorphic. Igneous rocks are formed when molten material cools. This gives you your granites or rhyolites, depending on where it cools, your basalts and your gabbros, all kinds of fun rocks. Sedimentary rocks are formed when eroded bits of other rocks become cemented together and lithified, or through chemical processes such as evaporation, precipitation, things like that. Metamorphic rocks are formed when pre-existing rocks, either sedimentary rocks or igneous rocks, are subjected to intense heat and or pressure and are changed on a physical and chemical scale. Metamorphic petrology is a lot of fun, but also very, very complicated. When you're looking at metamorphic rocks, there's a couple of questions that you want to answer. The first question is, what was this rock before it was metamorphosed? We call that the protolith, the rock that existed before it was subjected to heat and pressure that changed it into whatever you see now. There's a ton of different kinds of metamorphic rocks. I brought a couple out here just right now. This right here is a piece of gneiss. You can see it's got this banding that's very, very indicative of gneiss. And this is a metapelite, or for simplicity's sake, we'll call this a schist. These are foliated metamorphic rocks. There's also non-foliated metamorphic rocks. I should have grabbed a piece of marble, but we didn't. Foliated metamorphic rocks are rocks where there's an alignment of mineral grains or textures. You can actually see here on this metapelite, all the sparkly bits are micas, muscovite mica primarily in this case, and then these little red dots are garnets. A little bit difficult to see there, but there is an alignment. You can see it better on the bottom actually. Can you see how everything is aligned in kind of these parallel plates? All the minerals are kind of pointing the same direction. That's because this rock was squished and all the minerals were forced to align in that particular way. In this gneiss, we can see that alignment a little more clearly because the minerals have actually separated kind of based on color here. So this white streak through here, this is what we call a leucocratic band. This is made out of primarily quartz and feldspars, whereas the darker parts of this rock are made out of, in this case, primarily amphibolite and chlorite, or amphiboles and chlorite. Amphibolite is a rock that's made up primarily of amphibole minerals. I should have brought a chunk of amphibolite, but I did not bring one out with me right now. And this is kind of amphibolite gneiss. Anyways, a non-foliated metamorphic rock would be something like marble, which is formed from contact metamorphism of limestone. That's the second thing that we want to answer when we're looking at metamorphic rocks, is how were they metamorphosed? The two most common types of metamorphism are regional metamorphism and contact metamorphism. Contact metamorphism is kind of small-scale metamorphism. I talked about marble, for example. When you heat up limestone, it changes to marble. It recrystallizes and becomes marble. This can happen when you have a limestone unit that is intruded by a magma body. This will cause contact metamorphism with the rocks that the magma touched, because contact. Regional metamorphism is big scale metamorphism. This is metamorphic processes that occur due to tectonic activity. So you have a huge area that's going to be affected in a lot of different ways by tectonic plates interacting. You're going to have huge pressure gradients, huge temperature gradients, and you're going to see a wider range of metamorphism happening in this area. We could talk about metamorphic facies right now, and I'm kind of tempted to, but that's going to be a whole tangent. Suffice to say, a metamorphic facies describes the amount of metamorphism that is occurring. So you have different grades. You can have high facies metamorphism and low facies metamorphism, and basically, if you increase your temperature and your pressure, you're going to get higher grades of metamorphism. If you're not as hot or as pressured, it's going to be lower grades of metamorphism. And typically, things like hornfells and peelites, schists will be lower to middle metamorphic facies, and then things like your gneisses will be higher grades, and you can get to super high grade metamorphism with eclogites and things like that. But we're not going to be talking about eclogites today, unfortunately. Those are my favorite rocks, actually, but we don't get to eclogite metamorphic facies in the Manzano Mountains. All right, so those are our two big questions with metamorphic rocks. What was it before it was metamorphosed, and what event caused the metamorphization? None of those were words. These two questions are very, very important to understanding metamorphic complexes, because these are typically ancient rocks. Again, in the Manzano Mountains, we're talking about billions of years old. A lot has happened to these rocks in that stretch of time, and piecing together how they were deposited, what deformed them, when they were deformed, can be a struggle. But that's why we have scientists working on stuff like this. There's a lot that you can tell from analyzing metamorphic rocks. For example, if you expose a rock to enough heat or pressure, or both, certain minerals in the rock can start to dissolve or come out of solution and then recrystallize into new minerals. Those chemical elements that made up the previous minerals will recombine into new minerals, or sometimes it'll be the same mineral family, but it will form into a different crystal habit, different shape. Again, we talked about the alignment of minerals. You can have rocks be squeezed until other minerals align. And this can tell you about the stress and strain of a tectonic area. It can tell you about the depth at which the rocks are being metamorphosed at. Typically, the deeper you go, the hotter it gets, the more pressure there is. And this can help scientists start to piece together a little bit about the evolution of Earth's crust. The rocks in the Manzano Mountains have been interpreted as representing an event called the Mazotzal orogeny. I love the Mazotzal orogeny. It's very, very close and dear to my heart. And it's super complex and in some regards poorly understood. But I'm going to try and give you guys the Cliff Notes rundown right now. To tell the story, we're going to go back about 2 billion years. I know, that's a lot. And we're going to talk about the assembly of Laurentia. Laurentia is also called the North American craton. What is a craton? I am so glad you asked. A craton is kind of the keystone of a continent. It is the oldest stable chunk of continental crust that a continent is built around. It's characterized by being very, very ancient and having minimal deformation and alteration. The North American craton was formed about 2 billion years ago by the collision of 6 or 7 other pieces of Archean crust that formed what is now mostly the northern part of North America, as well as Scotland and Greenland. In fact, Scotland has kind of broken away from Laurentia, but Greenland is actually still tectonically a part of North America. They're separated by a seaway right now, but that's a more modern feature. And under the ocean, they're kind of just the same continent. All right, so I mentioned chunks of crust colliding to form Laurentia. What on earth does that mean? Well, Earth's continents ride on tectonic plates. In fact, the entire crust of the Earth is broken up into tectonic plates. Some of them have a lot of continental crust, which is thicker and lighter than the other kind of crust, which is oceanic crust, which is typically thinner and denser. These plates sit on top of the mantle, which is not a liquid. A lot of people think the mantle is liquid. It's not. It's ductile rock. It's very, very hot, but it's more like taffy than liquid. But these plates sit on top of the mantle and they move around. And this movement is caused by convection within the mantle, right? Heat rises, and that hotter material rises to the top while colder material falls to the bottom, gets reheated, and then comes back up again in this big cycle. That gives the mechanism for these continental plates to move. We do not know exactly when tectonic plates became a thing on Earth. For example, Mars does not have tectonic plates, at least not anymore that we can see. And that was probably a huge reason why Mars isn't more similar to Earth. Mars does exist in, the range for life to exist on Earth, but not having any tectonic plates kind of, shot it in the kneecap for becoming an Earth-like planet. How did modern tectonics get started on Earth? We're not sure. There's theories about drip tectonics in the past. We're not going to get into any of that, but we're pretty sure that we had tectonic plates moving around by at least 3.5 billion years ago. For context, the Earth is 4.56 billion years old, so fairly quickly Earth developed its tectonic plates system. But anyways, continental crust is lighter. It's less dense than the oceanic crust, and so it tends to sit on top of it. When you have two plates meet, one plate most of the time will subduct underneath the other one, and that's because one plate is typically denser. If the two plates have similar density, they'll just kind of push up like you see at the Himalayas. But if you have tectonic crust, or if you have continental crust and you have oceanic crust, the oceanic crust almost always subducts underneath the continental crust. So we have these plates that are moving around, and sometimes they will collide. And when you smush these two continental crusts together, instead of one just being subducted into the mantle and recycled, they merge. They just kind of crunch into each other. And what do you get? Tons and tons of heat and pressure. You start metamorphosing these rocks, and you're suturing them together. And eventually they become kind of merged into one big continent. The southern portion of North America was constructed in much the same way. We had terrains accreting onto the Laurentian Craton. The first of these was the Yavapai orogeny, which occurred about 1.75 billion years ago, and it is pretty solidly agreed upon that the Yavapai was an island arc accretion. So you can think of a bunch of islands that formed out in the ocean. Think something like Hawaii, hotspot islands. We had a ton of these island continents. No idea really how big they were. They were probably pretty massive. And they were sitting on top of a tectonic plate that slowly subducted underneath Laurentia. And when that happened, let's say that this is our oceanic crust subducting. We have our more evolved continental crust sitting over here. We're subducting underneath Laurentia, which is continental crust. As we're going under, we hit those islands, and instead of going underneath with the rest of the plate, they just kind of get like scraped up onto the other continent, just kind of meshed on there, fused on there, and this comes with a lot of faulting, a lot of volcanism. I mean, there's a lot of magma moving through the system. As you're subducting things, you're causing them to melt the lower they get, and then that melted material, because again, heat rises, can come back up to the surface and erupt as volcanoes. You have these mountains that are rising from this event. An orogeny is a mountain building event caused by a collision. So as you're building these mountains up, you're increasing erosion as rain is falling off the sides of these mountains. Gravity is going to be pulling things down. You've got a lot going on. You have a pretty intense system of mountain building and eroding all over the place. There were many of these island arc terrain accretions over the course of about 800 million years, ending with the Grenville orogeny about 1 billion years ago. And it's all very, very complicated. The Mosset was the second of these events. It followed the Yavapai, and for a long time it was assumed that the Mosset was also an island arc accretion. And that is, I think, kind of what most people lean towards. But there's also evidence coming forward that the Mosset might have been more of an extensional basin, or it might be more complex than that. We're not going to talk too much about that right now. The metamorphic geology of the Manzano Mountains is pretty complex, as most metamorphic geology tends to be. I mean, for heaven's sake, just look at this map. But before we get into the structure of the range, I'm going to go ahead and introduce you to the formations within the Manzano group. From oldest to youngest, these are the Tierras Greenstone, the Bootleg Canyon sequence, the Sevieta Metarrhyolite, the Abajo Formation, the White Ridge Quartzite, the Estadio Schist, the Sais Quartzite, and the Blue Springs Formation. Now, I'm not sure which formations I actually saw when I was out there because, again, I just like going out there for fun without looking at a geologic map and trying to put things together. But what I have put together is that I definitely saw the Sevieta Metarrhyolite. I recognized metarrhyolites out there while we were walking. Pretty sure we saw several quartzites, and I'm leaning towards thinking that some of the quartzites that we saw might have come from some of the other formations. Even though things like the Sevieta Metarrhyolite are called the Sevieta Metarrhyolite, that doesn't mean that that's all that's in that formation. That just means that the dominant lithology is metarrhyolite. So, for example, the Abajo Formation is made up of amphibolites and schists. The Sevieta Metarrhyolite has not just metarrhyolite, but also amphibolite and pelitic schists. I'm tempted to say that the quartzites that we saw were probably part of the Bootleg Canyon sequence. And I think as we got closer towards the top of the peak, we started to see definitely a lot of pelites, but also some amphibolites. And I'm going to have to go back and look through some of the notes and stuff I took up there. Okay, nope. I changed my mind looking at my notes. So I did this climb months ago, and I was a little bit rusty. Let me correct what I was saying. I believe that what we were seeing was actually some of the younger of the metamorphic rocks. Again, this area is intensely folded and deformed both by Mosset and Picaris, and probably Laramide and Rio Grande Rift deformation. We'll get into all that here in a little bit, but I'm pretty sure that the oldest stuff we saw there was probably Sevieta Metarrhyolite, more towards the bottom. And we worked our way up through the Abajo Formation, to the White Ridge Quartzite, the Estadio Schist. Oh my gosh. Anyways, the Estadio Schist, and then what we were probably seeing towards, I think probably the uppermost unit that we saw was the Sais Quartzite, maybe some of the Blue Springs Formation, but just from reading up on some descriptions of that formation, I'm not sure if we saw that at all. So, yeah. One of the most important things about analyzing a metamorphic complex is stress and strain analyses. This tells you how the rocks were being crunched. What direction was most of the pressure coming from? How are the rocks reacting to that? And that can really, really help geologists piece together these Paleoproterozoic tectonic provinces. What was happening here 1.6 billion years ago? Where was the deformation coming from? Was it an island arc accretion? Was it maybe an extensional basin? What's happening here? Now, it's not always that simple. And in fact, out here in the Manzano Mountains, we see overprinting from the Picaris orogeny. The Pickering orogeny happened about 1.45 billion years ago in the same area, and because it happened relatively very, very close to the Mosatzel and in the exact same places, it was also, this tectonic event was also changing the Mosatzel rocks that existed there previously. Now, some of the Pickering orogeny rocks include these huge plutons of granite that were intruded into the Manzano group. And then, of course, we had more pressure that foliated and folded these rocks again. So when we're looking at the Manzano group, we have to decide, okay, what is Mosatzel deformation? What's Pickering deformation? You can even go a little bit further and say, okay, what's Laramide deformation? And what's Rio Grande Rift deformation? Rio Grande Rift stuff's easier, mostly normal faults. The Laramide stuff's also a little bit easier to recognize. But Pickering and Mosatzel are hard to tell apart. And actually, the relationship between the Pickering and the Mosatzel is one of the more contested bits of study around the Mosatzel. Some people don't even think the Mosatzel orogeny happened. They think it was just the Pickering. I don't really buy into that, but it's very, very complex. How do you tell if a certain shear angle, if a certain stress ellipsoid corresponds to the Mosatzel or the Pickering deformation? Sometimes you can tell because, well, if we see one of these younger granites, one of these granites that's 1.4 billion years old, that's being intruded into these 1.6 billion year old rocks, and it has the same pattern of deformation as the older rocks, well, then that means that that deformation had to have happened after that granite was in place, which means that that deformation was overprinting on the older rocks. And so the deformation that we see in the older rocks can't be attributed to an earlier period. However, sometimes, if you dig hard enough, you can find, okay, these data points correspond to Pickering orogeny deformation, and these data points correspond to Mosatzel deformation. And then you build yourself a big old wonderful strain analyses chart, and you try to put together a likely sequence of events.
I was just telling Janelle metamorphic rocks are my shit, and this is why. This out here is, we got a lot of chlorite, but honestly it kind of feels like a quartzite. So we got like a chlorite quartzite. And then we have these little dikes cutting through. These are little igneous dikes, quartz rich and feldspar rich. These are granitic dikes. Those feldspars, those K-spars is what's forming that pink color. Very cool. And here we can actually see a little bit better some of that bedding I was talking about as we get, oops, a little bit higher. Right here, this outcrop could still be Precambrian. Kind of looks like we got like a little, I'm not sure what that is until we get up to it. But yeah, Janelle noted that some of this stuff is probably low-grade metamorphic. Probably got mid to low-grade metamorphism going on here. These are probably Mosatzel Yavapai transition rocks. So I'm guessing, I'm gonna guess 1.68, maybe 1.65 to 1.7 billion years ago. Wow, a perfect chair.
There's a bunch of chairs.
Oh wow, there's one for me too. Hell yeah. No, this isn't a chair. It's a stick and stump. I don't have an action throw. I've got a knife you can throw. Yeah, you got a knife too. You can throw knives. Gold Seal SRK, NCPM 3V. One of my faves. Ah, that failed. Wow, look at you and all your metamorphic petrology. So this right here, Janelle found, is really awesome. This looks like a feldspathic schist to me. We've got quite a bit of chlorite. We've also got some quartz, got some feldspars. Kind of looks like, you can see right here, this big foliation. We've actually got crenulations throughout this little rock here. we're starting to see a little more schistosity, a little more alignment of minerals. Yeah, so this means that we're getting into some more advanced metamorphism than the things that we were seeing previously. Of course, this is float. It's not much to go off of. Here, yeah, right here, look at this. We've got gneiss. So that definitely means that we're getting into some heavier duty metamorphism. So we're going to be in the Manzano Mountains wilderness. I think this is so funny. We have the no trace ethics, you know, basically pick up your trash. And we've got something that came off of someone's car. Crazy, crazy. And of course, don't drink the water. Brainy eating amoebas. Hell yeah. This area reminds me a lot of home. A little bit lower, you know, where I grew up. The valleys were at 9,000 feet and the peaks are at 12, but very, very similar. Beautiful. All right, so I was a little bit wrong. These rocks here that from the bottom look like tabular beds, this is still the metamorphic stuff. We're pretty high up. We're still seeing the metamorphic units. And Janelle pointed out that this looks like an anticline right here. And a syncline going that way. You can see the beds are kind of tilted like that. Right here, these ones are kind of tilted a little bit like this. So the hinge is probably right here where this arroyo, where this big erosional face is coming through. Yeah, that's a good idea. Yeah, we'll go back here to a big outcrop. So a lot of the stuff we've been looking at has just been float, but here we've actually got some excellent outcrop. And one of the things I was telling Janelle, something that I've learned from all the work on metamorphic rocks that I've done, is that when you look at the outcrops, like this right here, the geology of the entire system, the structure, the deformation of the entire system is reflected in the outcrops. So if we look at this right here, for example, this isn't the best. We can see these foliations here. We can see they have a certain trend and plunge is what we call them. They're oriented in a certain way in relation to all the other rocks in the area. And so this orientation right here is going to be a minute reflection of the orientation of this entire section right here as far as these metamorphic rocks go. Because what we're seeing here, these fabrics, this folding, I actually just saw a really cool crenulation. Go look at that real quick. This was all done under immense pressure. Nice little crenulation. Here's some good stuff right here. This was all done under immense pressure below the subsurface. Exactly, Paleoproterozoic. All this stuff was crunched, compressed, and folded. This entire mountain range before it was uplifted, of course. We can see that reflected right here. All right, so this outcrop is really cool. It's a little bit fucked up. This is an erosional surface here, but we can still see some pretty cool structures. So right here, I can see we've got a bend right there. You can kind of see it a little bit easier right there. We actually have over here, it looks like we had a dike cut through and then it was deformed again. Yeah, so this looks like, yeah, basically a bunch of big oceans kind of chained together right here. This looks like a pretty decent surface to get a decent trend. A lot of the times the rock will erode along the natural foliations. So we're gonna try and take some measurements right here. So first thing I want to look for is I want to see, okay, so what way is it trending and plunging? Right hand rule. Okay, I'm going to double check that with my manual tools here in a second.
Wait, no, this is striking. We need to turn and plunge.
I mean, it's the same kind of shit, but. So I use the right hand rule. Your thumb is going to point in the trend. Your fingers point towards the plunge. Okay. And this right here, I am seeing this.
Oh, so you're supposed to do it this way.
Yeah, I'm seeing this right here. So we're plunging kind of to the southwest, and we're going to be trending to the southeast.
That's like due.
Okay. I'm gonna take some measurements and we'll compare. All right, so Janelle took the measurement with my Brunton, and she got 160 by 32, and that means that a trend of 160 is to the southeast, like I said, and is dipping 32 degrees to the southwest. That's pretty close to what she got with the app, even though when she put the app down there, it was a little bit misaligned. But yeah, so right there's a data point. And if we were out here mapping this, making a map, making a stereo net, doing a structural analysis of these mountains, we would be throwing up and crying, but we'd be taking so many freaking measurements. We'd start way at the bottom, and honestly, if we're making a map here, I would not be coming along the trail we're coming along. I'd like to keep us a little more in the arroyos, where you're gonna see more bedrock exposure and a little bit less float. So there's a lot that goes into understanding the rocks and lithology and geology of an area, and I fucking love it. So here's an interesting feature. We've been coming through the tree line for the last little ways, but right here, this huge rock field, probably an ancient glacial feature. It used to probably be a glacier here, and all this stuff would have been either drug along under it or frozen inside it, suspended. Some cool shit. Wow. Well, here we are at the little saddle. We're going to be heading south to the peak. Pretty little meadow up here. We've got some skunk cabbage and some good grass. A couple of big fir trees. Yeah, we've got a little bit of snow up here. It's nice to see. It is April while we're doing this climb, so it is a windy season, unfortunately, but the weather has been absolutely phenomenal. The climb itself is not hard. It's a little bit windy. You know, they do sacrifice distance in favor of less steepness, so it does switch back quite, back and forth quite a ways, long switchbacks. Supposedly that was 3 miles on the bottom up to here, around about there. Kind of felt a little bit longer than that to me, but that might be because we took a lot of breaks to dick around and play with rocks and shit. There it is. And we still have metamorphic rocks up here. I think we might see some Paleozoic shit, but nope. Oh man. Oh gosh. I think so. You see those vertical beds too, don't you? Wow. There's our Paleozoic stuff. See the red? That's probably Abo Formation. Yeah, I can see it cropping out in here. So I'm guessing this whole thing is probably dipping this way. And so all the younger stuff is going to be there in the foothills. Wow. All right, so we're going to get ready to head down. I do want to mention just real quick, obviously, this peak is called, get here with the sign, Manzano Peak.
Apples.
Exactly, it's Spanish for apples. Back in the 1600s or 1700s, the Spanish explorers found apple trees at the southern end of this range, and that's where it gets its name. There's actually a lot of really important Spanish missions in this area. Just to the south of here, you had Abo Mission and Salinas Mission. In fact, way off in the distance, not there, that's Elephant Butte. Over here, that's Salinas Peak. That's out in the San Andres. Beautiful, beautiful up here. Not much of a view to the north because of the trees, but man, everywhere else, gorgeous. For the most part, the trail is very easy to follow. There's a couple spots where you gotta, do a little guesswork, but if you're a half decent trail picker, you'll find it no problem. The signage is not real great in some places. So if you like to use forest trail signs to orient yourself on a map or something, sometimes these are going to kind of suck. But if you've got, online type of stuff, you've got service all the way up to the peak. So you should not have a problem at all. But I don't know, this one could still get us lost. I don't put anything past her. She might walk us off a cliff. Ain't that right?
On purpose.
On purpose?
I want to die.
Damn, that's just rude. This part gets a little tricky. Ugh. You know what? Actually, I don't know why I went that way. You can probably just step over that. Sometimes I'm not the sharpest knife in the drawer. We were just up there. Still took my breath away, and I was expecting it. It's crazy. We're just that good. Well, we're almost back to the car, and we were just talking about our thoughts on this peak. I think we both really enjoyed it. I thought it was a lot of fun. Not too difficult. Challenging enough to feel good after you've done it, but not like it's not gonna kill you. And the views were amazing. The scenery all the way up was just gorgeous. The geology was on point. I really enjoyed this one. I'd definitely do it again. I'm giving this an 8 out of 10. Loved it. What's your score?
8.4.
8.4. Wow, you just gotta one up me, huh?
And it's the minus 1.6 is because of the wasp.
Minus 1.6 because of the wasps. We ran into some timber wasps up there. She does not like wasps. But yeah, that was a good one. Pretty solid.
And I think that's going to be pretty much it for today, guys. Thank you so much for watching this video. Big shout out to my channel members right here at the Cowboy level. I appreciate everything they do for the channel. If you want to become a member and get access to exclusive perks, there's a button down below. I've been Gideon, and I'll see you weirdos in the next one. Adios.